Imagine stepping off a cobblestone street into the foggy alleys of Victorian London's East End. The year is 1888. Around you, the city hums with the clatter of horse-drawn carts, the murmur of distant voices, and the faint whistle of factory whistles. But in the East End, the hum is different. It is not the polite chatter of the West End drawing its gas lamps into the night. It is a hum of survival, of struggle, of 1,000 lives squeezed into alleyways so narrow that the walls seem to close in with each passing step. The air is thick with coal smoke, mingled with the stench of human waste, rotting food, and the dampness that seeps from the walls of crumbling tenements. Every breath tastes of soot and despair, and yet life continues. Children dart through puddles of water blackened by filth, their bare feet scuffing the stones as they cry out for attention or alms. Mothers clutch their infants tightly, their arms the only shield against the cold and the hunger that gnaws at every home. Men with bowed shoulders and hands blackened from labor shuffle past, their eyes hardened by exhaustion, their lives measured not in years, but in the small, fleeting victories of surviving another day. This was the East End, a part of London so brutally divided from the rest of the city that it might as well have existed in another world. To the west, the city glittered. Elegant carriages rolled along polished streets, and the light from gas lamps reflected off the windows of grand townhouses. Tea rooms, filled with the chatter of the upper class, women in fine dresses swept along the sidewalks, and men tipped their hats with polite manners. But just beyond the polished facades, past the bridges that spanned the murky River Thames, another London thrived, a city built not on wealth but on survival. Here, progress had no meaning. The factories that powered Britain's empire poured smoke into the sky, but the men and women who worked in them saw no comfort from their labor. Their wages were meager, barely enough to buy a loaf of bread, and often not enough to cover the rent for a single room where a family of 8 or 10 would squeeze together for warmth. Life in the East End was a constant negotiation with death. Disease was an uninvited companion in every household. Cholera outbreaks swept through the alleys with terrifying speed, leaving nothing but fever and corpses in their wake. Tuberculosis haunted every doorway, coughing its victims into early graves. Typhus, smallpox, and dysentery were ever-present threats. Clean water was a luxury. The Thames, once a source of pride, had become a conduit for sewage and filth. Families drank what they could, cooked what little they had, and prayed that hunger would not claim their children before the diseases did. It was a brutal, unforgiving world where mortality hovered over every hearth, and yet the people adapted. They laughed when they could, bartered when they must, and scavenged every scrap of life from the streets and the alleys that surrounded them. Children were both the most vulnerable and the most resilient of the East End. Many of them had never known a life without hunger. They sold matches, polished boots, or begged on street corners for a few pennies, learning from an early age that survival required cunning and courage. Some fell into crime, not out of wickedness, but out of necessity, picking pockets or stealing bread to feed younger siblings. Their childhoods were measured in days survived, in the warmth of a stolen loaf, in the fleeting moments when laughter could pierce the constant gloom. Schools existed, but they were few, far between, and often impossible for children whose families required every pair of hands to work. For them, learning to read was a luxury. Learning to survive was the curriculum of life. The architecture of the slums itself seemed designed to crush the human spirit. Narrow alleys twisted and turned like the veins of a living organism, carrying the stench of waste, the cries of the hungry, and the echo of despair. Buildings leaned against each other, their walls blackened by soot, windows broken or covered in grime. Many tenements had no plumbing, relying instead on shared water pumps or public privies that were little more than open pits. Fires were a constant danger, and the poor had few means to escape. A single candle could ignite a disaster, leaving families with nothing but charred remains and memories of what once was. Despite the hardship, the East End pulsed with life. Markets thrived, selling vegetables, cheap meats, and fish pulled from the Thames. Street hawkers called out their wares, their voices rising above the clamor of the streets, while musicians played fiddles and pipes, offering a moment of distraction from the grinding poverty. Taverns provided the men with a brief respite, though often at the cost of a day's wages or a night's safety. It was a world of extremes, where misery and joy existed side by side, where laughter could emerge from hunger and friendship could form amidst filth. The social divide could not have been more apparent. Wealthy Londoners often turned a blind eye to the suffering in the East End, treating it as a separate universe. Charitable institutions existed, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer scale of poverty. Reports in newspapers painted the slums as breeding grounds for crime and disease, creating a narrative that blamed the victims rather than the system that oppressed them. Yet, within this darkness, communities persisted. Neighbors shared what little they had. Mothers exchanged tips on keeping children healthy. Fathers pooled resources to ensure that someone in the family would have work, no matter how minimal the pay. At night, the East End transformed. Gas lamps flickered on, casting elongated shadows across cobblestones wet with rain or sewage. The cries of children quieted, replaced by the coughing of the sick and the moans of those too weak to work. The fog rolled in from the Thames, swallowing the alleys and hiding the secrets of the streets. It was in this haze that crime found fertile ground, petty theft, burglary, and the work of gangs who had learned that law enforcement rarely ventured into these neighborhoods. Fear was constant, but so was adaptation. The people learned the rhythms of their environment, the safe corners, the quick escapes, the patterns of those who might threaten them. Survival required observation, cunning, and an iron will. The East End also bred resilience. Women who carried their children through the alleys were masters of endurance. They found food where none existed, created warmth from rags, and instilled hope in their children even when the world offered none. Men, battered by labor and illness, stood watch over their homes, protecting what little they had from theft or destruction. Children, hardened by the streets, learned skills of observation and persuasion that would serve them for life. It was a society that demanded everything from its people but gave almost nothing in return, and yet they endured. Industrialization had brought wealth to London, but only a fraction reached the East End. The factories, docks, and warehouses that lined the city provided work, but they also provided disease, injury, and exhaustion. Injuries were common, medical care was scarce. An accident on the docks could mean the loss of a hand or limb, a death sentence for the primary wage-earner of a family. Yet despite these hazards, people lined up every morning to work, because without work there was only starvation. Food scarcity was relentless. Bread, cheap and dense, was a staple. Potatoes were boiled in water, sometimes infested with maggots, because there was no alternative. Meat was a luxury for many families, purchased only on Sundays if there were enough pennies. Malnutrition was common, and children often appeared frail or stunted. Despite this, laughter occasionally rang out in the alleys, in stolen moments of play, or in the stories told by elders who remembered better times. These moments of humanity were fragile, fleeting, yet essential. And while poverty dominated the East End, it also gave rise to voices of conscience. Journalists, reformers, and writers began to expose the horrors hidden in the city's shadows. Photographs captured overcrowded rooms and gaunt children. Reports detailed crime born of desperation, disease born of neglect, and hunger that the city could no longer ignore. These accounts shocked the public, stirred debate, and slowly, painfully, laid the groundwork for change. The East End was more than a slum. It was a mirror held up to a society that prided itself on progress and empire, yet ignored the suffering that fueled its wealth. In this dense fog of coal, smoke, despair, and tenement walls, survival was the only currency that mattered. Every day was a negotiation with fate. Every alley held danger, every night brought cold, every meal was uncertain, and yet the people persisted. They built communities, forged friendships, and protected each other against the indifferent world beyond their streets. In their resilience, they embodied the raw, unvarnished truth of human existence, that even in the darkest, most brutal circumstances, life claws its way forward. The East End of Victorian London, with its narrow streets, overcrowded homes, and stench of decay, was a crucible of humanity. It was a place where hope flickered weakly but never died entirely. It was a place where every breath was a testament to endurance, where every step across the cobblestones carried the weight of struggle, and where the human spirit, though battered, refused to surrender. In understanding this part of London, we come closer to understanding the costs of empire, the consequences of neglect, and the extraordinary resilience of ordinary people. The East End was not merely a place of poverty. It was a stage on which the most primal and most profound aspects of survival played out every day, unseen by the city that prospered just beyond its edges. The streets of the East End were never quiet, not truly. Even before the sun rose, a low murmur of activity filled the alleys, though activity is a polite word for what it really was: struggle, labor, and the endless negotiation with survival. As dawn crept over the horizon, gas lamps still flickered in the damp mist, illuminating narrow streets lined with buildings that leaned on one another for support, as though the architecture itself understood the fragility of the lives within. Smoke from the factories mingled with the morning fog, curling around chimneys, twisting through windows, and settling on the faces of those who already bore the marks of toil. Men shuffled toward the docks, their shoulders hunched, their hands blackened from labor yet trembling with hunger, because even the promise of a few pennies for a long day's work was better than nothing. Women emerged from the tenements, clutching bundles of rags or children too weak to stand, threading through the streets with the precision of those who had memorized every hazard: broken pavement, open sewer, carts careening around blind corners. Children, some no more than 5 or 6, scampered barefoot over stones slick with rainwater and muck, carrying trinkets to sell or nothing at all, only the hope of survival guiding them forward. The work available was grueling, repetitive, and often dangerous. Men labored in shipyards, hauling crates of coal and barrels of tar, muscles straining as if the body itself were a tool rather than a vessel for life. Others worked in factories that pumped out textiles, chemicals, or machinery, their lungs filling with dust and smoke, their eyes watering, their skin irritated and raw. Women, often just as strong and far less protected, labored in sweatshops or domestic service, stitching endless seams of clothing, scrubbing floors that seemed to never stay clean, or carrying heavy loads for a pittance. The hours were long: 12, 14, sometimes 16 hours a day, and the wages could barely sustain a family. One misstep, one accident, and the day's work would vanish. Injuries were common, but medical attention was scarce, expensive, and unreliable. Many simply endured the pain until it became a permanent burden, a visible reminder of their struggle. Hunger was constant, a shadow that followed every resident. Food was meager and monotonous: stale bread, watery porridge, potatoes boiled until they lost all flavor. Meat was a rare luxury, purchased only when someone could scrape together enough coins, or when a neighbor shared what little they had. Children often went to bed with empty stomachs, their small bodies wasting away while their eyes burned with exhaustion and quiet determination. Malnutrition was rampant. It was not uncommon to see children so frail that their bones seemed ready to break under the slightest pressure, yet they continued to play, to run, to beg, and to survive. Even the adults bore the marks of hunger, thin faces, hollow eyes, and bodies that seemed older than their years. The East End was a place where life and death coexisted so closely that a single cold night or a minor illness could tip the balance irreversibly. Disease stalked the slums like an unseen predator, exploiting every weakness. Cholera outbreaks swept through families in hours, reducing a bustling household to silence and despair. Typhus and tuberculosis spread with ease in the overcrowded homes, carried by fleas, lice, or the very air that residents breathed. The filth of the streets, combined with poor sanitation, created a breeding ground for infection. Clean water was scarce, and wells often became contaminated, forcing people to drink what little they could access, knowing it could carry death with it. Sewers overflowed, running alongside homes and shops, spilling into alleyways and sometimes into living spaces themselves. Rats thrived in this environment, gnawing at scraps of food and sometimes at the inhabitants themselves, unchallenged by anyone who had the time or the means to intervene. The architecture of the East End itself compounded the misery. Tenements were cramped, damp, and suffocating. Rooms were shared by entire families, with children sleeping on the floors or even in cupboards. Windows were broken or covered with makeshift shutters, letting in neither light nor warmth. Cold penetrated every corner, and in winter the icy winds snaked through the cracks in the walls, chilling every body in sight. Heating was a luxury, coal was expensive, and fires were limited to one small stove per room. Families huddled together, sharing warmth in an almost primitive ritual, their bonds forged by necessity and fear. The smell of smoke, sweat, unwashed bodies, and decaying food was ever present, and those who lived there grew accustomed to it, though it never became pleasant. Children were not merely victims of poverty but participants in it. Their work began almost as soon as they could walk. Boys might carry water, sweep streets, or run errands for wages barely enough to buy a single meal. Girls worked alongside their mothers, helping with domestic chores, sewing, or scavenging for anything to sell. Many children were forced into crime as a means of survival, pickpocketing, stealing coal, or helping in illicit trades because the alternative was starvation. Education was rare, though the charitable efforts of reformers attempted to provide some schooling. For most, the classroom was replaced by the harsh lessons of the streets: observation, cunning, and endurance. Play existed, but it was short-lived and fraught with danger. Puddles were contaminated, alleyways were filled with hazards, and gangs or criminals were always a threat. Yet, in spite of the dangers, laughter occasionally emerged, fleeting and fragile, as if to remind the children and the adults that life, however cruel, still had moments of humanity. Poverty forced adults into moral compromises. Families stole to feed their children, lied to survive the authorities, and made alliances with local gangs for protection. Yet this survival was often misunderstood by the upper classes, who depicted the East End as lawless, immoral, and corrupt. Newspapers sensationalized crime, reporting petty theft as evidence of innate wickedness rather than desperation. Political leaders debated reform, but change came slowly, hindered by bureaucracy, prejudice, and the reluctance of those in power to acknowledge the depth of suffering in their own city. The East End, though densely populated and vital to the city's labor force, was largely ignored, allowed to fester in shadows while London's wealth grew just beyond the river, the labor itself was exhausting, repetitive, and often dehumanizing. Men and women spent hours performing the same tasks, their bodies breaking down under strain. Hands became calloused and raw, lungs blackened from coal or dust, backs bent permanently from lifting or bending. Children worked alongside their parents, enduring the same physical punishments inflicted by fatigue and hunger. Injuries were frequent, from cuts and burns to crushing accidents, but most could not afford proper medical care. Recovery was left to time, prayer, or sheer resilience. The body became a tool of survival, valued only for its capacity to labor, and discarded when it could no longer perform. Communities, though strained by competition for scarce resources, found ways to support one another. Neighbors shared food, offered shelter in emergencies, and banded together when authorities or gangs threatened them. Street markets, though small and chaotic, provided both sustenance and social connection. Hawkers shouted their wares, fishmongers sold their catch, and vegetable sellers displayed potatoes, cabbages, and carrots that would feed families for the week if purchased wisely. Music, religion, and occasional festivals provided small escapes from the relentless pressure of daily life. Despite the crushing poverty, human ingenuity persisted, allowing families to stretch resources, repurpose waste, and maintain dignity even in the smallest ways. Even death did not bring respite. Graves were shallow, crowded, and often unpaid for, forcing families to witness the bodies of their loved ones in mass burials or temporary plots. Funerals, when they occurred, were sparse and hurried, a final reminder of the relentless pressures of survival. Yet rituals persisted. Prayers, small offerings, and the telling of stories ensured that the dead were remembered, even when society at large had no interest in their lives. Amid the despair, reformers began to appear. Writers, journalists, and philanthropists documented the conditions of the East End, exposing the neglect to the wider public. Henry Mayhew, for instance, compiled extensive interviews with residents, revealing the reality behind the sensationalized headlines. Charles Dickens' novels illustrated the suffering, the injustice, and the resilience of the poor, shaping public consciousness and slowly nudging society toward reform. Schools were established, orphanages opened, and laws passed, but the scale of the problem was immense, and change came incrementally. Despite all these hardships, the East End never surrendered entirely to despair. People adapted, creating routines and strategies for survival that were passed down from generation to generation. The poor became experts at scavenging, repurposing, and making do with what little they had. Children developed resilience, street smarts, and an early understanding of social dynamics. Adults learned to navigate the complex web of employers, landlords, and charitable institutions, maximizing whatever small advantages were available. Every day was a negotiation with the city itself, with its hazards, and with the arbitrary forces that dictated life and death. The East End, in its filth and misery, was more than a collection of streets and buildings. It was a living organism, a crucible where human endurance, ingenuity, and compassion were tested constantly. Each alleyway, each tenement, each market stall, and each crowded room told a story of suffering and resilience. The people who lived there shaped the culture, the economy, and even the conscience of London, demanding attention whether the city wanted to acknowledge them or not. And yet, the story of the East End is not simply one of suffering. It is a story of humanity in extremis, of communities forming under impossible circumstances, of individuals making choices that balanced morality with survival. It is a story of courage, perseverance, and the unyielding will to live. Even as disease, hunger, and exploitation claimed lives, the people of the East End endured, leaving behind a legacy of resilience that would echo through the reforms, stories, and historical accounts of generations to come. Life in the East End was harsh, brutal, and often tragic, yet it was also full of quiet heroism. Every family that survived another week, every child who learned to read, every act of kindness amidst overwhelming scarcity represented triumph over circumstance. In the face of relentless poverty, disease, and exploitation, the residents of Victorian London's East End refused to vanish into obscurity. They existed, they fought, and they endured. Their lives, often overlooked by history, are the backbone of a city that prided itself on empire, wealth, and progress. Their struggle is a testament to the enduring human spirit, a reminder that survival is not merely about living, but about persisting with dignity, ingenuity, and hope in the face of almost unimaginable adversity. The children of the East End were perhaps the most poignant symbols of Victorian London's brutal inequality. They were born into a world where survival was never guaranteed, where hunger was a constant companion, and where the streets themselves became both playground and battleground. From the moment they took their first breath, they were introduced not to carefree innocence, but to a relentless education in hardship, resilience, and the art of survival. In these narrow alleys, amidst the smoke, filth, and ceaseless clatter of industry, childhood was fleeting, measured not by birthdays or school lessons, but by days survived, meals secured, and dangers avoided. Even before the sun broke through the dense fog that clung to the city, children were on the move. Some ran errands for their parents, carrying bundles of coal, fetching water from shared pumps, or delivering messages to nearby shops. Others were out selling small wares, matches, newspapers, pins, or scraps of fabric, hoping to scrape together a few pennies to contribute to the family's meager income. The older ones might work in factories, often standing for hours on end in rooms filled with spinning machinery, smoke, and the stench of chemical dyes. They learned quickly that mistakes could cost more than money. They could cost fingers, toes, or even lives. The youngest children, meanwhile, clung to their mothers, pulled along through the labyrinthine alleys, or crouched in doorways, begging silently, their wide eyes reflecting both fear and determination. The East End streets themselves were unforgiving. Puddles formed in uneven cobblestones, mingled with refuse and excrement. Open drains ran alongside homes, their black waters carrying disease and death. Rats scurried along these alleys in bold defiance of human presence, sometimes even nibbling at the unattended food or the children who dared to stray too far from their families. Every step carried risk, a falling cartwheel, an errant horse, a sudden quarrel between street gangs. Yet these children navigated the chaos with astonishing dexterity, learning the geography of danger from a young age, developing instincts honed by necessity rather than play. Hunger, the ever-present shadow, shaped their bodies and minds. Meals were rare and insubstantial. Bread, if available, might be stale or damp. A bowl of watery porridge could substitute for a proper dinner, and meat was a rarity so infrequent that children could go weeks without tasting it. Their bodies, starved yet resilient, learned to adapt to scarcity, and yet their energy seemed inexhaustible as they darted through alleys, climbed on crates, or played improvised games that mimicked the adult world they were already entering. Hunger created cunning, a stolen piece of fruit, a bartered loaf of bread, a coin snatched in the distraction of a crowded street. These small victories became milestones in the invisible curriculum of survival. Work was a central part of their lives. Boys might be apprenticed in factories or workshops, learning trades that would sustain them, but at great personal cost. Fingers were often mangled by machinery, backs bent beneath heavy loads, lungs filled with smoke and dust. Girls, too, were pressed into labor, often alongside their mothers, stitching garments in dimly lit rooms for countless hours, polishing boots in taverns, or tending to younger siblings while their parents labored. Labor was not simply a way to contribute to the household. It was an expectation, a survival mechanism, and for many, a way of life that began before they were fully conscious of the world around them. Crime emerged naturally from this environment, not as a choice, but as a necessity. Children were both victims and participants in petty theft, pickpocketing, or more organized street crime. To steal a loaf of bread or snatch a coin could mean the difference between survival and starvation, and in the dense, fog-laden alleys, opportunities were abundant. Street gangs began recruiting boys who learned quickly how to hide, deceive, and run. They developed networks of lookouts and safe houses, forming intricate systems of protection and subsistence. These gangs were not merely criminal enterprises. They were often communities of necessity, offering belonging, food, and protection in a world that provided none. Yet despite the omnipresence of labor and crime, moments of childhood persisted. Children played when they could, improvising games with sticks, stones, or scraps of wood. They mimicked adult behavior, acting out trades, quarrels, and household routines. Their laughter, though brief and fragile, rang out over the alleys, piercing the fog and the stench with fleeting bursts of innocence. Even in this harsh environment, they displayed creativity, intelligence, and adaptability beyond their years. They became storytellers, entertainers, and negotiators, navigating a social landscape that was unforgiving and dangerous. The family structure itself was strained by the demands of poverty. Mothers often bore the brunt of domestic responsibility, juggling the care of children, preparation of meager meals, and work outside the home, while fathers labored long hours in industrial spaces or docks. In many households, children were forced to mature rapidly, taking on responsibilities well beyond their years. Older siblings often became surrogate parents, ensuring that the younger ones were fed, clothed, and protected. The burden was heavy, but the bonds were strong. Survival required cooperation, resourcefulness, and an unspoken understanding of each person's role in keeping the family alive. Disease affected children with brutal efficiency. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making them especially vulnerable to the rampant cholera, typhus, and tuberculosis that swept through the East End. A simple cold could escalate into a life-threatening illness. Smallpox outbreaks, sometimes exacerbated by lack of vaccination, left scars both physical and psychological. Families were forced to confront death at a scale unimaginable in wealthier parts of the city. Yet children developed resilience. They learned which neighborhoods to avoid, which adults to trust, and how to protect themselves in a world where danger lurked in every corner. Education, though often scarce, was a beacon of hope for some. Charitable institutions and reformers attempted to provide schooling, offering a brief reprieve from labor and a glimpse of a life beyond the alleys. For those who could attend, learning to read and write opened doors to knowledge, employment, and opportunity. But for many, even a few lessons were interrupted by illness, hunger, or the demands of work. Schools were overcrowded and underfunded, teachers overworked and underpaid. Still, the very act of learning, of sitting with a book or reciting lessons aloud, offered children a mental escape from the relentless grind of their daily existence. Childhood in the East End was inseparable from the streets themselves. Every alley, every market, every tenement became a classroom in survival. Observation was a critical skill, noticing the patterns of carts, the habits of local gangs, the shifts in employers' moods. Cunning became essential, Negotiating for food, bartering goods, and protecting personal belongings required quick thinking and adaptability. Physical resilience was necessary to navigate slippery stones, carry heavy loads, and evade danger. Emotional strength was crucial to endure hunger, fear, and the frequent loss of friends or family. By the age of 10 or 12, many children possessed wisdom, experience, and skills that would surpass those of adults in less demanding environments. Social dynamics among children were complex and survival-driven. Alliances were formed, rivalries flared, and friendships were often temporary, dependent on the ebb and flow of resources and opportunity. Older children taught younger ones how to move unnoticed, how to secure food, and how to avoid punishment from authorities. Mutual protection networks existed alongside competition for survival. This was not play in the modern sense, but a structured, often brutal system of apprenticeship in life itself. The dangers faced by children extended beyond labor and crime. Fires were frequent, sparked by overcrowded living conditions, faulty stoves, or open flames. Collapsing buildings, particularly in decaying tenements, threatened life and limb. Harsh winters brought frostbite and illness. Summers brought heat, disease, and the stench of stagnant water. Despite these dangers, children learned to navigate the hazards with remarkable ingenuity. They climbed fire escapes, darted across alleys, and used the terrain of their environment to their advantage, demonstrating a precocious mastery of the streets that would serve them throughout their lives. Yet even in the face of hardship, small joys persisted. Children shared stolen or purchased treats, played improvised games, and created their own stories and songs. They crafted toys from scraps of wood, string, or cloth, turning the remnants of poverty into instruments of imagination. Music, dance, and storytelling became tools for resilience, allowing them to momentarily escape the harsh realities of life. Religion and superstition offered hope to some, giving structure and meaning to suffering, while communal rituals and traditions maintained a sense of belonging and continuity within fractured neighborhoods. The chronic stress of life in the East End shaped children psychologically as well as physically. They developed heightened senses of awareness and vigilance, an intuitive understanding of social hierarchies, and the ability to anticipate threats before they materialized. They learned negotiation, deception, and strategy skills that would serve them in adulthood, though often at great personal cost. Emotional toughness became a survival mechanism. Vulnerability could be exploited by peers, adults, or the merciless circumstances of their environment. Yet beneath this toughness, many retained remarkable compassion, empathy, and a capacity for connection, forged by shared hardship and the constant need for mutual support. Charitable reformers and writers took note of the plight of these children, bringing their experiences to public attention. Henry Mayhew's detailed accounts provided a window into the daily lives of working children, capturing not only the brutality but also the resilience, creativity, and resourcefulness that defined their existence. Philanthropists like Thomas Barnardo sought to provide shelter, food, and education, attempting to alleviate some of the most extreme suffering. While these efforts were limited in scope, they marked the beginning of a broader recognition that childhood was not merely a stage of labor and survival, but a formative period deserving of protection, nurture, and opportunity. Despite all adversity, the children of the East End carried the spirit of resilience. They adapted to circumstances that would have crushed the weak, learned to navigate a city indifferent to their existence, and often became the most cunning, observant, and resourceful members of society. Every alley explored, every coin earned, every danger avoided was a lesson in survival, a testament to human adaptability and a small victory in a life dominated by struggle. Their experiences, though harsh, forged a generation capable of endurance, ingenuity, and empathy, leaving a legacy that would influence not only the reform movements of the future, but the very understanding of what it meant to survive in Victorian London's most unforgiving quarters. The children of the East End were more than passive victims. They were agents of survival, navigating the complex web of hunger, labor, crime, and danger with remarkable skill. Their lives remind us that even in the harshest conditions, human beings, from their earliest years, are capable of ingenuity, courage, and perseverance. Every day they lived, every step they took, every challenge they overcame, was a story of resilience etched into the narrow streets, tenements, and alleys of one of the most brutal yet profoundly human parts of Victorian London. The East End of Victorian London was a city alive with shadows. It was a place where fog and smoke intertwined to form an almost tangible darkness that seemed to linger not only in the streets but in the very souls of those who lived there. Life was harsh, brutal, and uncertain, and in such a place, crime did not merely exist, it flourished. In the narrow alleys, between the overcrowded tenements, and along the banks of the polluted Thames, survival and lawlessness were inseparable, two sides of the same coin. Hunger and desperation blurred the lines of morality, creating a society where acts that would be condemned elsewhere were tolerated, understood, and sometimes even necessary. Children who had grown up navigating the alleys became adept at stealth and deception. Pickpocketing was a common skill, taught and refined from a young age. A child might slip through a crowded market, finger a coin from a merchant's pocket, and disappear into a narrow passage before the theft was even noticed. Older boys and girls joined informal gangs, learning to work together in coordinated thefts, to watch for patrols, and to protect one another from rival groups. In this environment, loyalty and cunning were crucial. A misstep could result in violence, punishment, or starvation. Crime was not glamorous. It was a survival strategy, a language spoken fluently by the young and the desperate alike. Street gangs were both feared and necessary. They patrolled territories, defended members, and provided access to resources that were otherwise impossible to obtain. For many children and young adults, gangs offered protection, food, and camaraderie. They were schools in themselves, teaching lessons of strategy, observation, and resilience. Adults, often weary from labor, sometimes tolerated or even relied on these networks as extensions of the community, recognizing that in a place where law enforcement was inconsistent and resources scarce, these informal organizations could serve a protective function. Yet their presence also heightened danger. Rivalries could erupt into violence, leaving broken bodies in alleyways, and disputes over stolen goods could escalate to fatal confrontations. The police, though present, were largely ineffective in the most desperate neighborhoods. The Metropolitan Police patrolled the East End, but they were outnumbered, underfunded, and often inexperienced in handling the complex social dynamics of the slums. They were trained to enforce the law, but the law itself was often irrelevant to the people struggling to survive. Bribery, negotiation, and avoidance became the preferred methods of dealing with authority. Children learned quickly which officers were sympathetic, which could be intimidated, and which were too indifferent to pose any real threat. The police were a presence, but rarely a solution, and in many ways, the very scarcity of effective law enforcement contributed to the cycle of crime, poverty, and desperation. The environment itself encouraged crime. The East End's labyrinth of narrow, twisting alleys provided both concealment and opportunity. Open markets, dimly lit streets, and crowded living quarters created a dense network in which theft could flourish. Doors were often unsecured, windows broken or absent, and personal property minimal and easily movable. For those desperate to survive, these conditions were less a temptation than a necessity. Every corner might conceal a rival gang, a hidden stash of goods, or a chance to snatch food or money. Knowledge of the streets, vigilance, and agility were essential skills, honed over years of experience that began in childhood. Desperation in the East End was constant and pervasive. Hunger drove men, women, and children to acts that would be unimaginable in wealthier parts of the city. Mothers scavenged through Refuge to find food for their children. Fathers might gamble away wages in the hope of securing more. Children learned to steal bread, coal, or small items to trade for survival. Every day was a negotiation with circumstance, where morality was measured not by abstract ideals, but by the immediate need to live. Survival demanded cunning, strength, and the ability to anticipate danger, traits cultivated in a population that had little choice but to adapt or perish. It was in this environment that one of history's most infamous figures emerged, Jack the Ripper. The year was 1888, and the East End was already notorious for poverty, crime, and disease. Whitechapel, the heart of the slums, became the stage for a series of murders that would terrify not only London but the world. Jack the Ripper's crimes were brutal, methodical, and terrifyingly precise. They struck at women who were themselves victims of circumstance. Many were forced into prostitution by poverty, abandoned by society, and trapped in the endless cycle of survival. The Ripper's presence added a layer of fear to the already dangerous streets. Where once the threat had been hunger, disease, and petty crime, now there was a predator whose motives were unknown, whose strikes were swift and horrifying. The murders, while shocking, also revealed the systemic neglect of the East End. The women targeted were not random. They were emblematic of the most vulnerable members of society. Their deaths highlighted the combination of poverty, crime, and institutional indifference that defined life in Whitechapel. Residents were acutely aware of the danger, yet many had little choice but to continue their lives in the very streets where the Ripper stalked. They moved with caution, learned the patterns of the city, and relied on each other for protection. The fear was palpable, but survival demanded courage and adaptation. In this climate of terror, communities developed informal systems of support. Neighbors kept watch, families banded together, and local businesses provided safe havens when possible. Word of danger spread quickly through the alleys, and the community's collective awareness became a lifeline. The East End was, paradoxically, both lawless and highly organized, a testament to the resilience of its inhabitants. Survival was not solitary, it was communal. Knowledge, vigilance, and cooperation were as vital as strength or skill. The economic conditions of the East End also reinforced the prevalence of crime. Work was scarce, wages were low, and the cost of living often exceeded the income that even multiple family members could earn. Hunger, disease, and overcrowding created pressures that made petty theft, prostitution, and informal trade not just rational choices, but necessary ones. Children learned early that opportunity often lay outside the boundaries of the law, and their formative experiences in these conditions shaped a generation capable of extraordinary resourcefulness and cunning. The moral landscape of the East End was complex. Acts that might be condemned elsewhere were often tolerated or understood in the slums. Stealing a loaf of bread to feed a starving child was not viewed with the same moral outrage as it would be in wealthier neighborhoods. Gangs provided protection, organized labor, and access to resources, balancing the thin line between order and chaos. Individuals navigated this world with acute awareness, making decisions constantly that weighed survival against risk, necessity against danger. The environment itself demanded pragmatism, and those who thrived were those who adapted, observed, and learned the intricate rules of this harsh social ecosystem. Prostitution became another aspect of survival, particularly for women who had few alternatives. Economic necessity forced many into the streets, where they faced not only the moral judgments of society, but also violence, disease, and exploitation. Their work was dangerous, their wages minimal, and their social support often non-existent. The presence of predators, both within and outside the criminal networks, made their existence precarious. Yet, they navigated this world with the same combination of resilience, cunning, and adaptability that characterized all who survived in the East End. The interplay of crime, poverty, and fear shaped the very identity of the East End. Streets were named not only for their location, but for the activities that defined them: markets, taverns, dens of gambling, and hideouts for those fleeing justice or misfortune. Knowledge of the geography became a survival skill. Residents memorized alleyways, shortcuts, and safe havens. Children learned to run, hide, and observe, their instincts honed by necessity. Adults negotiated with gangs, employers, and police, balancing threats and opportunities with the precision of a skilled strategist. Crime, however, was not merely an individual choice, but a reflection of systemic failure. The city's neglect of sanitation, housing, and labor conditions created fertile ground for lawlessness. Poverty was a constant companion, shaping behavior and limiting options. The inability of authorities to provide protection, the scarcity of employment, and the prevalence of disease all contributed to an environment in which crime was not only common but inevitable. Residents adapted, creating survival strategies that blurred the lines between legality and necessity. The fear generated by Jack the Ripper, while extraordinary, was only the most extreme manifestation of the ever-present dangers. Most residents faced daily threats that were less sensational but no less deadly: attacks from gangs, accidents in overcrowded tenements, fire, disease, and hunger. The Ripper murders intensified existing anxieties, reminding the population that even the streets they knew so well could harbor unseen threats. Yet life continued. Markets opened, factories operated, and children played in alleys when the adults were distracted. Survival required vigilance, but it also required persistence, ingenuity, and an unyielding will to endure. Community networks adapted to these conditions. Families shared food and resources. Neighbors watched over one another, particularly the vulnerable. Streetwise children became protectors of younger siblings. These informal support systems were not charitable in the conventional sense. They were practical, necessary, and often life-saving. Mutual dependence became a hallmark of East End life, and those who refused to participate risked isolation, vulnerability, and failure. The prevalence of crime and violence also shaped the culture of the East End. Stories of clever escapes, daring thefts, and audacious schemes circulated widely, becoming part of the oral history of the streets. Residents learned not only from personal experience, but also from the tales of others, internalizing lessons about trust, risk, and opportunity. In a society where formal education was limited, these stories served as a form of practical learning, preparing each generation for the harsh realities of their environment. Despite the brutality, moments of humanity persisted. Acts of kindness, cooperation, and bravery were not uncommon. Residents helped neighbors during illness, shared food with the hungry, and protected children from gangs or predatory adults. These small acts did not erase the hardships, but created pockets of resilience and hope. They demonstrated that even in a world dominated by fear and scarcity, compassion could survive, often in the most unexpected places. The East End was a crucible of experience. Crime, fear, and survival were intertwined, shaping the lives of every resident. Jack the Ripper may have become the symbol of horror, but the everyday dangers, poverty, disease, hunger, and exploitation, were far more pervasive and insidious. The ability to endure, adapt, and navigate this landscape defined the people of the East End, leaving a legacy of resilience, ingenuity, and survival that would echo long after the fog cleared and the streets were rebuilt. In this environment, survival was not passive. It required observation, strategy, and courage. Children grew into adults capable of navigating complex social systems, negotiating threats, and seizing opportunities with precision. Adults balanced morality, necessity, and pragmatism, understanding that the world was indifferent to their suffering. Every day was a negotiation with circumstance, and those who survived did so not because of luck alone, but because they learned to adapt to the rhythms of the streets, the patterns of danger, and the unspoken rules of a society that demanded everything from them while offering almost nothing in return. Crime, desperation, and fear were woven into the fabric of East End life. They were not anomalies but defining characteristics, shaping not only the survival strategies of individuals, but the collective identity of the community. The streets themselves became teachers, instructing each resident in the lessons of caution, cunning, and resilience. The alleys echoed with the footsteps of the fearful, the bold, and the desperate, creating a rhythm of life that was harsh, relentless, and profoundly human. Even as the fog lifted and the city changed, the lessons of the East End endured. The inhabitants, molded by the crucible of crime and survival, carried forward knowledge, skill, and resilience that would influence generations. They became witnesses, survivors, and chroniclers of a world where lawlessness was inseparable from daily life, where courage was measured in small victories, and where the ability to endure defined the measure of a person. The East End, with all its darkness, danger, and despair, was a testament to the human capacity to survive, adapt, and resist even in the face of relentless adversity. The workhouse was one of the most feared institutions in the East End of Victorian London, a place where the destitute went not for comfort, but for survival. To step inside a workhouse was to enter a world where hope was rationed, individuality was erased, and suffering was institutionalized. It was the last resort for those who could no longer provide for themselves, where the poor, the elderly, the infirm, and children faced a regimented life designed to punish as much as to sustain. In a city where hunger stalked the streets, where disease lurked in every corner, and where crime was often a necessary recourse, the workhouse represented both salvation and condemnation, a paradoxical refuge that demanded submission and resilience in equal measure. The architecture of the workhouse was imposing, deliberately designed to inspire awe and fear. Tall, gray brick walls surrounded the institution, punctuated by iron gates and barred windows. The buildings themselves were stark and utilitarian, with little attention to comfort or aesthetics. Inside, long dormitories housed dozens of residents. Their narrow beds, aligned in uniform, rose like the cells of a prison. The air was thick with the mingling sense of sweat, unwashed bodies, and the faint tang of disinfectant, an attempt to control the filth that seemed inseparable from overcrowding. Lighting was dim, often relying on small, flickering oil lamps that cast long shadows across the stone floors. The very design of the workhouse emphasized control, hierarchy, and discipline, a constant reminder that those who entered had little freedom and even less autonomy. The daily routine was rigid, unyielding, and designed to break the spirit of those who entered. Dawn brought a call to wake, and with it the first test of endurance, a morning inspection by overseers who scrutinized every resident for cleanliness, behavior, and compliance. Beds had to be made to exacting standards, floors swept, and bodies washed in communal facilities that were barely adequate for the number of people using them. Meals were simple and unpalatable, designed more to sustain than to nourish. Thin porridge in the morning, watery soup at midday, and bread with gruel in the evening. Portions were deliberately small, reinforcing the notion that relief from hunger was conditional and that suffering was part of the moral education that the workhouse sought to impose. Labor was the cornerstone of life in the workhouse. Able-bodied men and women were assigned tasks designed to occupy them from dawn to dusk, often menial, repetitive, and physically taxing. Men might break stones in the yard, haul heavy loads, or perform maintenance tasks under the watchful eyes of overseers. Women scrubbed floors, washed laundry, cooked meals, and cleaned the facilities, their work hours stretching from early morning until well past sunset. Children, even at tender ages, were not exempt. They were tasked with sweeping, carrying water, or assisting in kitchens and workshops, their labor framed as preparation for the harsh realities of adult life. This work, while necessary for the functioning of the institution, was also a form of moral discipline, a constant reminder that poverty was a punishment for failure or sin, and that survival required obedience, endurance, and submission. Discipline in the workhouse was strict and often harsh. Misbehavior, laziness, or resistance was met with punishment ranging from verbal reprimands to physical labor beyond normal expectations. The fear of punishment was pervasive, instilling a sense of constant surveillance and control. Inmates learned quickly that compliance was the only path to relative safety, and that the rules, however arbitrary or cruel, were absolute. This environment cultivated resilience, patience, and cunning, as residents navigated the delicate balance between obedience and self-preservation, learning to endure humiliation, discomfort, and indignity with quiet determination. The food, though sufficient to prevent immediate starvation, was often nutritionally inadequate. Residents suffered from scurvy, rickets, and other diseases associated with poor diet. Children grew thin, their bodies weakened by insufficient nourishment, yet they were expected to work, maintain decorum, and endure the long days of labor without complaint. The psychological toll was significant. Individuals internalized a sense of inferiority, shame, and desperation, feeling simultaneously grateful for the shelter and humiliated by the conditions. The workhouse was a crucible of human endurance, a place where physical suffering and psychological stress intertwined to create one of the most harrowing experiences of Victorian London life. Family life in the workhouse was fractured and constrained. Couples were often separated, and children were housed in separate dormitories from their parents. The intimate bonds that might have offered comfort outside were disrupted, leaving residents to navigate the harsh environment largely on their own. Limited opportunities for privacy, combined with strict rules and the ever-present scrutiny of overseers, created a sense of isolation even amidst crowded conditions. Emotional resilience became essential as individuals were forced to cope with the absence of familial support, the pressures of labor, and the constant fear of disease or punishment. Disease was rampant in the workhouse. Overcrowding, poor sanitation, and insufficient medical care created conditions in which infections spread rapidly. Typhus, cholera, tuberculosis, and smallpox were common, taking lives indiscriminately and often overwhelming the limited capacity of the institution to respond. Infected individuals were sometimes isolated, but treatment was rudimentary and often ineffective. Mortality rates were high, particularly among children and the elderly, reinforcing the perception that the workhouse was as much a place of suffering as a refuge. Despite this, residents endured, finding ways to survive amidst the filth, disease, and constant labor. The workhouse also served as a stark reminder of the social hierarchy and inequality of Victorian London. Wealthier citizens, removed from the hardships of the East End, viewed these institutions as necessary tools of moral and social control. The poor were expected to accept their suffering with humility, and the workhouse was framed as both a punishment and an opportunity for redemption. This attitude reinforced social divisions, making the workhouse not only a site of physical hardship, but also a symbol of societal neglect and moral judgment. Residents internalized this hierarchy, understanding that their survival depended on compliance, endurance, and a willingness to submit to authority. Children in the workhouse learned the harshest lessons of life early. Education, when offered, was basic, designed to instill obedience rather than intellectual curiosity. Reading, writing, and arithmetic were taught alongside lessons in punctuality, cleanliness, and deference. Play was limited, and opportunities for creativity or leisure were almost non-existent. Despite this, children developed resourcefulness, learning to navigate the institution's routines, avoid punishment, and protect younger or weaker peers. The experience shaped their understanding of the world, teaching them that survival often required resilience, cunning, and the ability to endure discomfort and injustice. For many, the workhouse was not just a physical space, but a psychological landscape. Residents internalized the rules, the routines, and the constant surveillance, creating a mental framework that emphasized compliance, vigilance, and endurance. The monotony of labor, the scarcity of food, and the rigid hierarchy created a world in which small victories, completing a task without reprimand, securing a slightly larger portion of food, or finding a brief moment of rest, were celebrated and deeply meaningful. These moments reinforced the human capacity for adaptation, demonstrating that even in the most oppressive circumstances, individuals could find ways to assert agency, however limited. Life in the workhouse also highlighted the gendered dimensions of poverty. Women faced unique challenges, often performing the most physically demanding domestic tasks while caring for children and enduring scrutiny from female overseers. Their labor was undervalued, their autonomy restricted, and their vulnerability heightened by overcrowding and exposure to disease. Men, while also subjected to arduous labor, faced different pressures, maintaining strength for physically demanding tasks, navigating authority, and coping with the humiliation of institutionalized control. Gender roles were strictly enforced, reinforcing societal norms even within the confined and oppressive environment of the workhouse. Despite the harshness, the workhouse was a space of survival, adaptation, and occasionally community. Residents learned to share limited resources, support one another in illness or labor, and navigate the complex social hierarchy of the institution. Alliances were formed, knowledge was passed down, and the most observant or resourceful individuals found ways to make life marginally more bearable. These networks were subtle, often invisible to outsiders, but they were essential to enduring the relentless pressures of institutionalized poverty. The workhouse experience was formative in shaping the population of the East End. It instilled resilience, endurance, and the ability to navigate extreme hardship. Individuals who survived emerged with skills, strategies, and psychological fortitude that were crucial for life in a city defined by poverty, disease, and crime. While the institution was oppressive, dehumanizing, and often deadly, it also became a crucible in which the most essential human qualities, ingenuity, adaptability, and perseverance, were tested and honed. Public perception of workhouses was often detached, influenced by moralistic and class-based prejudices. The wealthy and the middle class viewed the poor as deserving of their plight, framing the workhouse as a corrective measure for laziness, immorality, or failure. Reports, pamphlets, and even popular literature depicted the workhouse as both a necessary evil and a tool of moral education. The reality, however, was far more complex. While the institution provided shelter, food, and labor, it also inflicted psychological trauma, disease, and physical strain on those least equipped to endure it. Survival depended not only on physical endurance, but on social intelligence, observation, and the ability to navigate an oppressive system with strategy and care. Workhouses were also breeding grounds for stories of ingenuity and quiet resistance. Residents found small ways to reclaim agency, smuggling extra food, forming covert networks of support, or assisting one another in completing labor tasks more efficiently. These acts, though minor in the larger scheme, represented defiance and adaptability. They were evidence of the human spirit persisting even in spaces designed to suppress it, and they offer a glimpse into the resourcefulness and resilience that characterized life in the East End. The experience of the workhouse shaped generations. Children who entered learned early the importance of observation, strategy, and endurance. Adults carried forward lessons in pragmatism, social negotiation, and resilience. The institution, while harsh and dehumanizing, became an integral part of the life cycle of the East End, leaving an indelible mark on the population and shaping the survival strategies that would define the community for decades to come. In many ways, the workhouse was both a refuge and a crucible. It provided shelter, food, and minimal protection from the dangers of the streets, but it demanded obedience, resilience, and adaptation. Those who entered were stripped of autonomy and subjected to constant labor, surveillance, and discipline. Yet within these confines, human ingenuity, solidarity, and perseverance endured. Small acts of kindness, resourcefulness, and quiet defiance punctuated the harsh routine, creating pockets of humanity in an institution designed to minimize it. To understand the East End, one must understand the workhouse. It was a mirror reflecting both the neglect of society and the resilience of its most vulnerable citizens. Life within its walls was punishing, unyielding, and often terrifying. Yet it also forged survival skills, resilience, and adaptability that were essential in the broader, equally harsh world of Victorian London. The workhouse was not merely a place. It was an experience, a test, and a defining chapter in the story of a community forced to endure, adapt, and survive against overwhelming odds. Even after decades of poverty, crime, disease, and fear, the East End of Victorian London bore a strange, enduring vitality. The streets that seemed so inhospitable, the alleys thick with smoke and filth, the tenements crowded beyond reason, were not merely sites of suffering. They were crucibles of human endurance. The people who inhabited them were survivors in every sense, shaped by circumstance, yet remarkably creative, resilient, and capable of profound humanity. Life in the East End demanded ingenuity, courage, and adaptability. Those who endured did so not through luck alone, but by learning, observing, and navigating a complex web of social, economic, and moral challenges from childhood to adulthood. The East End's children, forged in adversity, became its greatest testament to resilience. Their survival required a skill set far beyond what might be expected for their age: keen observation, rapid problem solving, an understanding of social hierarchies, and the ability to anticipate danger in a city that offered no mercy. They learned the geography of fear and opportunity simultaneously, memorizing alleyways, market patterns, and the habits of local gangs. Every day presented challenges that demanded immediate solutions. Hunger required ingenuity, disease demanded vigilance, crime required cunning, and authority demanded careful negotiation. These were lessons no school could impart, lessons learned in the theater of the streets. lessons that would serve them for life. The adults of the East End, hardened by years of labor, poverty, and exposure, became masters of survival. Men and women navigated the intricacies of employment, often relying on informal networks to find work, resources, or protection. They learned the value of observation, understanding when to obey and when to defy, when to bargain and when to flee. They negotiated relationships with employers, authorities, gangs, and neighbors, using social intelligence as a weapon of survival. Despite exhaustion, hunger, and illness, they maintained their families, protected their children, and carved out moments of normalcy amid chaos. They endured not only for themselves, but for the generations that followed, ensuring that the knowledge and strategies of survival were transmitted, creating continuity even in a society marked by instability. The East End was not merely a site of deprivation, it was also a site of community, cooperation, and small victories. Residents developed informal networks of support that mitigated some of the harshest aspects of poverty. Neighbors shared food, helped care for sick or orphaned children, and provided shelter during crises. Children, even in the harshest environments, formed social networks that allowed them to navigate the dangers of street life, teaching one another to hide, bargain, and survive. Markets, street performances, and communal gatherings, though modest, provided spaces where life could be celebrated and resilience reinforced. These moments of community, though fleeting, were crucial in sustaining morale and hope, reminding residents that survival was not purely individual but collective. Religion and spirituality offered another layer of support. Churches and chapels served not only as places of worship, but as centers of charity, education, and moral guidance. For many, faith provided hope, structure, and a framework for interpreting suffering. Clergy, philanthropists, and charitable organizations extended relief in the form of food, clothing, and schooling, creating pockets of assistance in an otherwise indifferent society. The moral teachings of religion encouraged resilience, patience, and compassion, reinforcing social bonds and offering solace in a world dominated by deprivation and danger. For children, education provided by religious institutions offered both literal and metaphorical light, guiding them toward opportunities beyond the East End's narrow confines. The East End's harsh realities also fostered ingenuity and creativity. Residents learned to make do with scarce resources, repurpose discarded materials, and improvise solutions to daily challenges. Children crafted toys from scraps, adults fashioned clothing from rags, and families stretched meager meals through inventive cooking techniques. Markets thrived in spite of poverty, relying on barter, negotiation, and ingenuity. Every act of resourcefulness was a form of resistance against deprivation, a declaration that even in a world of scarcity, life could be shaped, managed, and sustained. Ingenuity became a form of survival, and survival became a measure of character, courage, and persistence. The collective experiences of the East End left a profound